welcome everyone who's tuning in to this live DRA office hours on the Wake County Public School System graduation rate. My name is Roger Regan, and I work in data research and accountability. We're also joined today by Brian Pittman from High School Programs. Thank you, Brian, for agreeing to participate in this. Also, for those of you who are watching this this presentation as a recording, thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at my email address. So I have about 8 slides to present, should take probably around 10 minutes. Then we're going to turn it over to Brian, and he's going to talk about what he thinks high schools have done successfully over the past 8 years or so, and best practices going forward. So let me get started with my presentation here. Again, thank you for joining. And for those of you, I think all of us are experienced with Zoom at this point, or Google. Put your microphone on mute and turn your camera off. I think we'll probably wait on introductions. We could probably do that later or in the chat box. When we do have questions, of course, you can unmute your microphone at that point. So let me get started. Today's data conversation is about the graduation rate. 3 objectives that we have are, I'm going to summarize trends in the Wake County grad rate over the past 10 years or so, and highlight some of the remaining challenges. And then I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and he's going to talk about best practices, strategies that high schools can use to make improvements in their graduation rates. Here's a big overview of Wake County's 4-year cohort graduation rate from when it was the state first required us to report it through this past year, 2020. What I wanted to highlight here is from 2007 basically to 2012, the district's rate was fairly flat. It was in the high 70s and low 80s. But beginning in 2013 and continuing over the next 8 years, the district has increased its grad rate by an average of 1 percentage point or so every year for the last 8 years. And this past year, 2020, was the first time the district has ever surpassed 90% with their 4-year cohort graduation rate. One of the biggest driving forces, and we can discuss this more later on, in this increase in the graduation rate has to do with the reduction in the dropout rate in the district. The number of dropouts has declined from over 1,000 back in 2012 to this past year is 540. But numerically, that has been the major driving factor for the increase in the district's graduation rate. And as we'll see on the next slide, it has occurred among all subgroups that we track. In this slide, I'm going to show you just a line graph for each of our subgroups that we track, from female, male, to racial groups, to ED as economically disadvantaged, students with disability, and English proficient. And I'm going to have a line here showing what the rate was in 2016 and what it was this past year. So the district rate in 2016 was 87.1. Last year was 90.8, so an increase of about 4 percentage points. The female rate was 90.2% 5 years ago and has increased to 93.5%, about a little over a 3% increase. The male rate from 84% to 88%. And here I just want to highlight the fact that the rates for both of these groups, females and males, have gone up. Females started higher than males, so they're much higher as well. But also the gap between these groups hasn't really narrowed very much. It was 6 percentage points in 2016, and right now it's about a little over 5 percentage points. And this is true of every subgroup. Within every subgroup, especially the racial subgroups, there's a gap between females and males. Looking at subgroups by race, Asian students have the highest grad rate in the district. In 2016, they were at 95.4, but this past year they rose to 97.6. White students went from 93% to 95.8. The next line is for Black students, which went from 81.1 5 years ago to 87%. So the increase in the Black student rate was almost 6 percentage points, which was higher for some other groups. And you can see by looking at the gap between whites or Asians and Blacks that that gap has narrowed over the past 5 years. And if you were to look at these lines going back 10 years, the narrowing would be even more evident. Looking at Hispanic students who still have the lowest rate in the district, their rate 5 years ago was 73.6. Their rate this past year was 79.9. They have increased about 6 percentage points, and they have narrowed the gap between other groups and them has narrowed. But as we'll discuss, and I'll show you more later, this group not only has the lowest rate in Wake County, but the lowest rate across the state of North Carolina. Wake County has done a good job over the past years raising this rate, but it is still the subgroup in North Carolina that has the lowest rate. Looking at at-risk groups, economically disadvantaged, 5 years ago was 75.6. This past year was 81.5. This has been and going back 10 years, it's been even a bigger gain, but this has been a pretty dramatic increase as well. Students with disability, a little less so, starting at 71.2 in 2016, rising to 76 percent last year. And finally, limited English proficient students or English language learner. Last year, they were at 70.9. You don't see where they were 5 years ago because I use 60 percentage point as the minimum for this axis, and they were at 45%. There has been a big increase in the graduation rate, but partly the increase was due to a change in the rules that DPI made in 2017, where the number of students in that subgroup is increased to include students who exited from LAP status. So that's basically the picture of grad rates by subgroups. And the message here is basically all of them have improved their graduation rates, and there has been a narrowing among subgroups. However, there's still gaps among a lot of these groups. Next, I want to turn to high school graduation rates. Last year, there were 32 high schools in the districts, including our special schools and our academies and early colleges. I have this graph, and unless you have great vision, you won't be able to make out the names of the high schools, but they're all there, and they're in ascending order by graduation rate. What I want to focus on here is that line around 95 percentage point. Since that was the goal the district set for itself 5 years ago, let's look at where high schools have gotten to since then. So as of last year, 12 of our high schools were over 95%. So about 1/3 of our high schools have already district goal. 5 of those high schools are at 100%, mostly early colleges and academies. We have 10 high schools that are between 90 and 95%. Okay, so they are on their way to meeting that 95% goal as well. So adding those two together, we basically have 2/3 of our high school that are over 90%. We then have 7 high schools that are between 80 and 90%, and 3 high schools that are less than 80%, and those are Longview, Score Academy, and Phillips. However, I also want to look, I want you to take a look at that green bar in the middle is the district rate, okay? But that red bar toward the bottom is the state of North Carolina's rate, which last year was 87.6. So as you can see, the large majority of all of our high schools are currently higher than the state of North Carolina. Looking at just this past year alone, 2020, the grad rate was 90.8%. So what happened to those other 9.2%? This this cohort started ninth grade in 2016-17. Okay, and the 4-year cohort grad rate we expect to graduate by July of 2020. Okay, so over the course of that 4 years, students come in and out of the cohort. Okay, but the final cohort is the ones who we have documentation for. They're counted as either in our school, graduated, or we were the last district that they were found in. Okay, so the 9% that did not graduate, what happened to them? Okay, 4.3% or 548 students dropped out over the course of those 4 years. And they dropped out in ninth grade, in 10th grade, 11th, and 12th. In most cases, just once. There are a few students that come back. But the point is that the dropouts occur over the 4 years of the cohort, not all at once. That 548 students obviously is a lot of kids. But compared to 10 years ago, it's half of what the number used to be. 3.5% of the students were still in school as of the summer of 2020. 442 students. And typically, about half of these students will graduate in their 5th year. So if you look at Wake County's 5-year cohort grad rate, we are over 91% this year. And if this trend continues, we will be around 92.5% next year for our 5-year. So looking at the 5-year grad rate, we are getting even closer to that 95 percentage point. These students still in school, 442 students, half of them are their English language learners or students with disability. And for a variety of reasons, it's in their benefit to be in school 5th year. The next group, 90 students, 0.7%, we were told they either left school to enroll in a community college or some other educational pursuit that DPI does not recognize as a diploma granting institution. It could be Job Corps or some other type of venue, but we wanted to distinguish them from dropouts because these students made a point of saying they were pursuing another educational option. We had 0.5% of students in the cohort that we don't have an official code for. They're unknown. Most likely, the majority of these students were dropouts. We couldn't find documentation for them, or the code that we submitted to DPI was disputed. They weren't found. So 69 students is quite a few, but we used to have over 300 5 years ago. So we have made progress in improving the coding of students. Finally, that 0.2%, 23 students received certificates. According to DPI's cohort grad rules, students who receive a certificate are considered non-graduates. They're typically on the occupational course of study, but since they didn't receive a diploma, they count against our grad rate. So in total, then we had 1,172 non-graduates last year. This next slide takes a look at how Wake County's grad rates compare with other North Carolina districts. And this is based on last year. Most of these bars here are gray, but the blue one is Wake County, and the yellow is the state of North Carolina. And we typically compare ourselves with Durham, Forsyth, which is Winston-Salem, Guilford, which is Greensboro area, Charlotte, Chapel Hill. And what I've shown here by subgroup is that Wake County is at the top of almost all these subgroups, except for Chapel Hill typically has higher rates across the board. It's a much smaller district. But in all students in male, female, Asian, Wake County has either the highest or the second highest rates. When you go over and look at Hispanic students and economically disadvantaged, the grad rate among Wake County students is lower than several other districts. And that has been true for a while. And even though we've closed the gap with a lot of districts, our grad rates for Hispanic students and economically disadvantaged are lower than the state of North Carolina and lower than some of our comparison districts. We do a good job with students with disability. limited English learners. But those two groups do stand out. So then finally, this is my last slide. I've looked over at the research that DRA has put together the past 10 years or so, correlations with dropping out and not graduating. These 4 factors stand out. Number 1, reading difficulty. We have showing that students who are not proficient in reading in grades 3, grade 8, or grade 9 are more likely to drop out. Students who are chronically absent, who miss more than 10% of the school year in any one year, are most likely to do worse in school, and often that leads to dropping out. Suspension among students. If you're suspended, your likelihood of dropping out goes up, and if you're suspended more than once, it goes way up. And finally, retention. If you're retained in a grade in high school, which is usually because you failed English or math or social studies or whatever, the more you're retained, the more likely it is you won't graduate on time, and the more likely it'll be that you'll drop out. So all these factors are related to each other, but they're definitely things that high schools have been working on in the past 5 to 10 years. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Brian Pittman right now. My last slide here just shows that we will next session 2 weeks from now at 3:30. So unless I have any, maybe actually, should we take questions now, or I'm afraid if we start, we might lose time. So I'd rather turn it over to Brian and stop sharing my screen, and go from there. We can always come back to this presentation if we have to.
So thank you, Roger. And first, thrilled to be asked to be part of the conversation, and certainly happy to be. And so one of the things in talking with Roger for this, he asked to share what are some of the things that high schools are doing that are really impacting their graduation rate and are making a difference. And I think that probably most of the things that we would talk about probably fall into one of 3 big buckets of process, programs, and people. And I'll talk through each of those just briefly to give you a sense of what I mean. The first one of process, it's not the attractive one to talk about, but it has made a lot of difference, I think, in the overall graduation rate for a number of high schools. And by that, what I mean is, how do we track what happens and what's our process and protocol in the building when a student withdraws? And I think that schools have really done a great job of developing some processes and expectations in their building around whether it's a senior who is or isn't on track, or a 9th grader who moves to Nebraska. What is our process for tracking, and what happens when a student withdraws from one of our Wake County high schools? I think the tracking and the process around that has really helped high schools to be able to eliminate some of those places where, as Roger said, the number of unknowns we used to have and the number of dropouts that we used to have is down considerably. And I think a big part of that is the great job that schools have done about tracking those withdrawals. For example, when I was still at the high school, it was the process in our building that every single time a student withdrew, no matter what the reason was, then I got a copy of their withdrawal form. There was a process we went through every month of matching up the students who were coded as withdrawing for whatever reason in Power School with what's the documentation that we have. Because I think often what schools were finding was that we knew where the student went. We knew that this is what happened, but 3 years later, when they're a 12th grader and they're still listed on the cohort, it's not easy to produce the documents or get the documents then if you didn't at the time of withdrawal. And so I think a lot of that conversation at high schools of who's responsible when they withdraw, when we have a legitimate dropout, What are the protocols that are in place? Our SAP counselors have done a lot of work around due diligence with this that has really made a big difference in, I think, our outcome in terms of just how do we track all of this. The second big bucket, I think, really has to do with programmatic things that schools are doing. Some of that comes to things that schools are doing for seniors in the senior year who are potentially not going to make it in the last little bit, who fail a course that they need for graduation. I think each of our schools has developed some summer school options or super senior programs in the month of June leading up to that date that we can count students as graduates. Schools have done a lot with that to recover some credits and gain credits during that time so that students can still be counted as graduates. In some cases, still being able to walk with their peers. In many cases, not being able to walk with their peers, but still being able to get that diploma in the month of June and move on. I think another programmatic piece that high schools have really focused on really has to do with MTSS. And again, what are our processes, not only when a student is retained? I mean, we spend a lot of energy and time on how do we support students who have been retained, but I think most of our high schools have also shifted to what do we do when a student has a D or an F on their report card for first quarter, for their interim? And how are we engaging students with that when we can still make a difference prior to the student not getting credit for the course and having to repeat it or go through credit recovery? I think it's really important here to call out that the core of this, I think, really is our assistant principals and our counselors within our high schools who have truly done a phenomenal job of making intervention processes, making progress monitoring processes work, and really staying on students when they have that low grade on the interim, when they have that low grade on the quarter grade before we get to final grades posting. And realistically, in terms of next steps at the moment, I think this is where one of our current challenges is that school closure and COVID have really upended a lot of our programmatic methods that we had for keeping students on track. And the ability of the counselor and the AP to get more directly involved and support the work of the teacher in trying to find success for the student. That's much more difficult at the moment in our state of closure, but we'll be back in the building soon enough, and hopefully that will help. But we still have kids, as we talked with high school students not too long ago, they clearly expressed they still have all the normal goals for this year of wanting to graduate and finish strong and make good grades. And so, right now, I think schools are really problem solving some of that programmatic piece that's always worked for us, and how do we do that differently? But they're doing a great job with that. But again, really want to call out the hard work of counselors and APs to do that. I think the last big bucket there really has to do with relationships. There's been a tremendous effort as we look back at the last 5 to 10 years in the district on focusing on SEL and being sure that all students hopefully see themselves in their school, see themselves in the assignments that they do in their school. And I think that there is an unquantifiable nature of that as it relates to the graduation rate, because we always talk about students will perform when they know that you care. Well, students also feel a greater connection to their school and their teachers and to the need to persevere when they see that connection of seeing themselves and knowing that their voice matters in their school. And I think there's just, again, an unquantifiable nature of that in our graduation rate, because I think schools have done a tremendous job of really trying to focus in on that and making sure that's a core part of their work. I think a last piece there with people that's important to call out is I think that great work, and I see several folks from Title I on the call, that largely has been led by the Title I team. A lot of great work around family engagement that's happened within the district. A lot more of that connection with families and caregivers and parents. I think that's had a tremendous impact on our ability to raise the grad rate as well, because I think schools have found ways to effectively call out that, it's not just the student to pass the course, it's the connection with the family, it's the partnership with the family, to have a plan of all of us rowing in the same direction, to be sure that there's no avenue but exit only. You don't have a choice but to exit, and the only way to do that is with a diploma. And so I think a lot of that family engagement work has really had a strong impact on our graduation rate. I think we are working to try to identify some of the subgroups and some places where we'd like for the graduation rate to be higher, and pulling together a group that can try to support some programmatic next steps at the district level around that. But I think it's also important too, as we talk about grad rate and we talk about subgroups and the closing of the narrowing of gaps, I think it's always important that we call out why it's important to say that the gaps are closing, and we call out why it's important to say that this group or this school as a whole has defied predictability in terms of who graduates. And the reason why that's important is not about getting our grad rate to 95%. Why that's important is because you want to be able to stand in front of that next group of ninth graders that's coming in and show them your grad rate data and all of your subgroups and say, look, in this building, you may defy predictability and achieve more than you ever imagined that you could. And in this building, we've got data to show that we do that. And I think that's really important to call out with the grad rate as we talk about the numbers and we talk about the trends and all of that. It really isn't about the numbers. It is about being able to say to our students and our families, anything is possible within our Wake County high schools. And I'm so proud of the leadership in our school buildings that has really done an incredible job of defying predictability and making a lot of things happen for kids and making our students believe that they can make happen in those buildings anything that they want to. And I think that's a really critical message. And I think our schools do such a phenomenal job of communicating that to students. That's all I got. Certainly happy, as Roger said, to answer questions if we have time for that, or talk through any points of that. And so, Roger, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. That was very insightful and inspiring. And I'm looking from the data and focus on numbers, but I think you talking about the process, the programs, the people, and really at the end of the day, it's about the students and their success. Really is, an inspiring message, and I think will motivate people in schools. So thank you for all of that. Sonia has indicated or said that anyone who has a question to put it in the chat box. Also, I guess we could, let me see. If anyone wants to just turn on your mic and ask a question, that's fine as well. I'm not seeing my chat box here, so let's see. Does anyone out there want to just turn on your mic and ask a question? I'm not sure who all is on this call right now.
Hey, this is Cindy DeFore. How you doing, Roger?
Hi, Cindy. I'm doing well.
I
Thanks for joining us.
have a question. I'm wondering if there are some of our high schools that would be kind of outliers in terms of like best practices and things that we could look at in terms of what are they doing that's working well.
Okay. I have looked at high schools' changes in their grad rates over time, and I don't know if we have any outliers as far as, I mean, we have a lot of very successful schools. And I think even schools that have a little lower grad rates have done a great job as well, because their grad rates were lower, 5 to 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think you're right. Some schools seem to do better with different subgroups than other schools. That's something we could look into more. And I think maybe Brian might have some insight into that question, since he was a principal and he knows what high schools are doing.
So I think one of the strengths of the last few years really has been a focus, and really I'd call out Drew's leadership on this prior to my arrival in this position. I think there's been a very intentional focus on getting schools to share what some of the practices are so that they can be replicated throughout the district. For example, a school in the last few years shared just what they were doing to be sure that getting the student across the finish line was not just a function of the student and their current teachers, but it was a function of every teacher that they had ever had, every coach they had ever had in that building, to the point of calling out to the staff, these are the students who are at risk of not graduating. And it really is amazing what that list looks like in January versus in June. It is a much bigger list in January than it is in June. And I think that one of the strategies really was calling that out so that any teacher that had a relationship with that student could encourage them and connect with them and help keep them moving forward. So I really think that schools sharing those strategies so they could be replicated has really been a strength. I don't know if there's a school that I would specifically call out as being one that I would highlight as doing this or that is outside of the box. And I think part of the reason for that is some really intentional cross-pollination of ideas between schools that have benefited all. Yeah, Becky, I would agree. I think anything that we can do with family support in our high schools, and I think that really calling out too that some of our Title I high schools have really built up a toolbox of family engagement strategies that I really think potentially can make them leaders, increase the amount of leadership they have, because they already are leaders, across our high schools, and sharing out some of those strategies. I think it's an excellent comment.
And I also think that that's going to be increasingly important because, Brian, as you mentioned, and Roger, you as well, that our high schools have done just a fantastic job with cleaning up their data. And I mean, our data is it's pretty solid at each of our high schools. So that means that we need to do something different. And so looking at new strategies to try to figure out how we can keep our kids, our students engaged and getting them across that stage is going to be very important if we expect to see that rate continue to rise. So Roger, we are 5 minutes over, but we'll open the floor up for one more comment or question before we close things out.
Well, I'm just going to, as we close things out, and I don't see a question, I'm just going to take the opportunity, since I don't know that anybody can mute me fast enough, to just call out my thanks for all of the work that happens behind the scenes to support the grad rate. Tons of support happen and come from the data research and accountability team, from the SIS team and technology services, from counseling and student support services. And I think as a building principal, I had, to quote AJ from Mutillo from a recent meeting, I had no idea as a building level leader how many people were supporting my work in meaningful ways. And so for all of those groups, I will just offer thanks for all that you do to support the work. It truly is, there are lots of people in a team effort to do this, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you, Brian. And I think with that, we're going to close this out. If you didn't catch all of it, please look for the recording. And if you want to see the PowerPoint, that's in there as well. Also, if anyone has any follow-up questions for me or Brian, please send us an email or give us a call. Thank you again for joining us today. Look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.